Mr. Secretary, your book has been described by some people as a revenge memoir,
Oh, that's people who haven't read it.
as settling scores.
Not at all.
Why did you write the book?
I wrote it, I started thinking first that I wouldn't write a book. And George Shultz talked to me and he said, you know, you need your slice of history. And it should be there. And I said, well, many of the books I've read are written in a year. They're written by somebody else. They're kind of shallow, and it didn't look like that to me. And he said, well, that's the nature of it. So instead of doing a one-year book, I decided to spend 4 years. And instead of simply writing the book, I decided to digitize a large portion of my archive and make it available to people so that they can actually read the book, look at an endnote, and then go to the website, which is rumsfeld.com, and see for themselves. If I've quoted a paragraph out of a memo I wrote 5 years ago, they can go in there and read the whole memo. And it's the website is filled with hundreds of primary source documents. So this book is not one of those quick and easy things. There's some 1,300 plus endnotes.
Well, it is very readable, but in the book you also do render some judgments about people, about how they did their job. Do you think you're capable of sort of having that same clear-eyed, balanced look at your own performance in office?
Well, time will tell. I tried to be fair in discussing how the interactions went in the National Security Council, for example. I tried to talk about the pluses and the minuses of others as well as me. And I've been around this town so long, and you'll recall the differences between Brzezinski and Vance, between Schultz and Weinberger, between Kissinger and Bill Rogers and Kissinger and Schlesinger. This doesn't mean these are bad people. They're good people, and they're capable people. There are certain institutional realities that cause differences from time to time. But good, sensible people can also differ in their views. I tried to describe those in a straightforward way.
Did you find much fault with yourself?
I think so. Talked about a number of things that I wished had come out differently, decisions that were made, events that occurred.
One of the things
who knows? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
One of the things you mentioned was that you thought in retrospect it was a mistake not to step aside after Abu Ghraib.
Right. I offered my resignation twice, and I could not find a way to fire somebody who had a clear responsibility for Abu Ghraib.
Now, you took responsibility, right?
I did.
Did you feel responsible? Really?
I certainly didn't feel at fault for it. It was something that happened thousands of miles away in the middle of the night. But you look down the operational chain, and some of those people had already left, and some of the people in there were new and were not responsible. And same thing with the administrative chain. I mean, the task was to properly train people and equip them. Sanchez had a headquarters there that the Army and the Joint Staff did not properly staff. So here he was, a very junior general, in the obvious person who was over Abu Ghraib. And I just felt it wouldn't be right to pin it on him.
So you took responsibility in the sense that you were the guy at the top.
You bet.
Therefore, you're responsible.
You bet. And when the ship runs aground, the skipper's responsible.
Well, you don't think what happened in Abu Ghraib is in any way related to either actions you took or maybe actions you didn't take?
Absolutely not.
In terms of, you put a lot of pressure on people for actionable intelligence. You needed actionable intelligence. Do you think by putting that pressure for intelligence and maybe not emphasizing to the same extent, and by the way, don't abuse anybody in the process, that you might somehow have been responsible for creating a climate that allows
absolutely not. If as you must be aware, having read the book, none of the people who were abused at Abu Ghraib were targets for interrogation. They were simply unlawful combatants being kept off the field. So none of them were being interrogated by anybody. Second, none of the people doing the abuse were interrogators. They were prison guards. So the implication of your question is obviously inaccurate on its face.
Let me take you back to September 11th. In the book you say that you, in one of your first conversations with Dick Cheney, that he informs you about the decision to authorize the shoot down of planes if necessary, and he seems to be under the impression that maybe some planes have already been shot down. How did that happen? How does the Vice President of the United States have that kind of misinformation?
Well, Jamie, people who serve in these jobs have tough jobs, and they have to make decisions based on imperfect information. And information gets revealed over time. And so in this particular case, there's a perfectly obvious explanation, which the 9/11 Commission, I think, wrote up. The Vice President was in the White House in the bunker in the basement. He talked to the President of the United States, who was out of state at a function. But they discussed the problem, and the President authorized the Vice President to issue an order to shoot down a plane in the event it appeared to be attacking a major target in the United States. There were hundreds of airplanes in the air. The decision was made to ground aircraft so that a plane that did not go down would be pretty obvious as a possible problem, either a communications problem or a terrorist problem. A plane crashed at Shanksville. The Vice President knew that he had authorized people to fire against a plane that looked to be engaging a target, and he heard that a plane was down. It was not surprising that he got a report from somebody indicating that a plane was down and may have been shot down. It turned out it wasn't, thanks to
But you know that kind of stuff fuels conspiracy theories. There's
oh
still
my
people today who think...
goodness, what nonsense, the conspiracy theories. Really, you've worked in the Pentagon. You know everything leaks out of there like a sieve. If there were conspiracies, everyone in the world would know it. You're talking about honorable people, decent people who've served the country. And the suggestion that they fuel conspiracy theories, I think, ought to be embarrassing.
Speaking of decent, honorable people, along with your book, I was also reading General Shelton, Hank Shelton's book, who was the Joint Chiefs Chairman when you took over, and for a short time after September 11th. And he has a considerable different recollection of some of the events. For instance, when Diane Sawyer of ABC asked you about, did you intimidate these generals with the stars on their shoulders, you kind of scoffed at that. But Shelton said that you had kind of an anti-military attitude, that you weren't willing to listen. And in fact, he tells a story. He says that while Truman had a sign on his desk that said "the buck stops here," he always thought you ought to have a sign on your desk that says "Don't tell me, I already know."
Well, we were not a good fit, General Shelton. He certainly had a fine military record. He was there for a period of months while I was there, and then he was gone. I'm sure he was disappointed that he was leaving just at a time that the country was under attack. I've never really bought into the argument about intimidation. I think if a person gets 3-4 stars on his shoulder, one ought to have a little more respect for their courage and their confidence. It's true that I had a sense of urgency that many people in the Pentagon did not have. And I tried to impart that sense of urgency because I was concerned about our country. I was concerned about the risks we faced of additional 9/11 attacks. And there were people who were in a different mode and worked at a different tempo. And but the idea, if one looks in my archive and on the website, you'll find any number of memos where I've said to people, find out what people think. Bring them in here. If someone's in the room with me, I expect them to be willing to speak up and say what they think. Now, if I ask a question and somebody gives me a terrible answer, I admit I have a lot of trouble pretending it was a good answer.
Well, Shelton does say in his book that if he, quote, stood up to you and had his facts together, that you would generally back down, in his words.
I was listening to everybody, anxious to have people do that.
But the other thing Shelton talks about is in those first days after September 11th, the meeting that took place in Camp David, when you're talking about options and what to do and how to proceed. And he says that from the very beginning that you seem to be fixated on eliminating Saddam Hussein.
That's not true. The only person who brought it up at the Camp David meeting was, as I recall, Paul Wolfowitz. And the president said we're focusing on al-Qaeda and we're focusing on Afghanistan, and that was the last we heard of it.
Yeah, because he tells that story, but he says that you were the one that was pushing for Iraq and that the president sort of...
That's not correct. It's just factually wrong.
Yeah.
I don't know who wrote his book, but That is not the case, and I think if you talk to anyone who was there, they would understand that.
Speaking of Iraq, the entire world could argue about, whether we went to war on the right basis or how
Sure.
the war was conducted, but it's done, and we have the result that we have, and Saddam is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we could agree that the United States paid a heavy price for that in terms of thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of wounded and billions of dollars, and even taking some hits to maybe our national prestige. Was it worth it in the end?
Well, I think the president made the decision that almost anyone in that position would have made. If one thinks of what Senator Kerry was saying, Senator Clinton was saying, former President Clinton was saying, Al Gore was saying, they all had come to the same conclusion. And the intelligence material that President Bush was receiving, I think he made the right decision. Now, in retrospect, where do we stand? Well, the world is a lot better off with that regime gone. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He was at war with Iran. He killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and he'd been on the State Department's terrorist list for years. He was shooting at our aircraft almost every day, some 2,000 times. The American and British aircraft that were patrolling the northern and southern no-fly zones. And one of the side benefits of the effort, obviously, is the fact that Gaddafi had a nuclear program, and after he saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, he stepped up and said, wait a minute, I do not want to be another Saddam Hussein, and he called in inspectors, and they saw that he was, in fact, dismantling his nuclear program. So there are non-intuitive effects like that occurred.
One of the things I think that some people hoped might come out of the Iraq intervention was that it might change the whole face of the Middle East. Do you think we're seeing that today in maybe a slightly more less violent way with what's happened in Tunisia and in Egypt? Does that have the potential to change the face of the Middle East?
I suppose it has the potential. I think it's early to know. The fact of a democracy, a representative government in Iraq that's admittedly not mature and not a perfect model, but finding its way, dealing with the Sunni, the Shias, the Kurds in that country, I think is an example that might give encouragement to people. One would hope that there could be a popular movement in Iran, which had a popular revolt, and then what happened is a handful of Ayatollahs took over, and they have a quite repressive regime. We saw in Gaza a popular revolt, and Hamas now is in charge. We saw a popular revolt in the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, and now Hezbollah is in charge. And I think the reason I'm cautious in answering your question is it's February of 2011, and we don't know what's going to happen in Egypt. Egypt's a big, important country, and one would hope that they would find their way towards a freer political system, a freer economic system. But we all have to be realistic that the people who, at least on a number of occasions, prevail are not the Democrats. They're not the people that one would hope would prevail. They're the ones that are the minority, that are vicious, tough, well-organized, and disciplined. And in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, my guess is that they are better organized and more disciplined and more vicious than many of the democratic groups that were represented in the popular revolution that's been taking place in Egypt.
Well, we're just about out of time, your time, not my time, but so two quick things. One is on Iran. In Shelton's book, he says you asked for war plans to overthrow the regime in Iran, and that he presented them and you weren't happy with them because it involved too many troops, up to 500,000 U.S. troops.
For Iran?
For Iran.
Yeah. That is really a selective memory. When I came in, I asked to see some of the war plans, which is part of the job of the Secretary of Defense, to say what's on the shelf, and let's take a look at what you've got. I looked at the one for Korea, and as I recall, it did not even include the possibility that North Korea had a nuclear weapon. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, that plan is stale. It's been on the shelf too long. What I better do is take a look at all of them. And I did. I started going in on Saturdays and having them present me war plans for every place in the world that we had them. To select out and say that I asked for one on Iran, which I don't even recall doing. I can recall doing, 6, 8, 10, 12 of them, and having people come in, I think is a misunderstanding or a misrecollection.
Which is, I wanted to ask you about the CNN report. Back in, after Saddam fell, CNN's executive vice president, Easton Jordan, wrote a piece, "The News We Kept to Ourselves." You refer to it in your book, in New York Times op-ed. You say that you characterize in the book as he didn't, that CNN didn't report this news because they wanted to keep their staff in place in Baghdad reporting. In his piece, Easton says that he did it because the sources of the information, lives would be in jeopardy if they reported. Many of them were Iraqis who worked for CNN. Do you think that's a legitimate reason to hold back on that information? If you believe that people's lives are in danger?
Well, certainly if lives are in danger, one has to be sensitive to that. The only question is, are there ways to mask sources of information so that you don't find people's lives in danger? And I'm not in a position to make that judgment.
Right. Well, thank you. I found your book to be a really good read. I think it's a great effort, a good addition to our history, and I commend you for writing it, and I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.